the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 11.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ray. It is so good to have you today. We shift gears a little bit and we talk about environmental issues and regulations across the United States with Lance Brown from PACE, and you can find Lance at energyfairness.org. But before we get to that, I mentioned the API-YP Houston chapter a few weeks ago on the show, and we had a meeting for the members about 2 weeks ago now. And it was really a good time to get and to interact with other members. So if you're not a member of API-YP and you're in the Houston area, I highly recommend that you at least give these guys a look. I will link to their website in the show notes. And actually, episode 2, James Gordy talks about young professionals in the workplace and the API-YP. And so you can go back and listen to that. We will link to that as well. And so just for all my young professionals out there, I want to give a reminder that there is organizations that are built for us to understand how to do our jobs better, and we can get mentoring, and we can get experience, and we can get skills, and all the things we need to become better professionals in the workplace through organizations like this. And one more thing, I am curious, are you going to NAPE? NAPE is coming up, and we will link to that in the show notes as well. And I am considering going. I haven't necessarily booked my room just yet because I have a few other conflicting things that may pop up, but I'm looking at going to NAPE. If you're going to be at NAPE, please shoot me an email, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com, and let me know that you're going to be there. I would love to meet up with you while I'm in Houston. It will be a great time just to sit down and chat and to hear about what you have going on in your world and exchange some ideas. Now, as I mentioned, we have on Lance Brown from PACE, and we get into all kinds of things around energy policy as far as the government and regulation is concerned. And so you can find a link to Lance's full bio and all his information in the show notes, so check those out. And without further ado, here's my interview with Lance Brown. Well, Lance, it's so good to have you on the Global Energy Leaders Podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Let's get the audience up to speed on PACE and what you guys do there. So if they're not familiar with you, what do you do at PACE?
We're a 501c4 not-for-profit organization that really advocates for fair and sensible energy policies. I started the group 8 years ago because I felt like the dialogue about energy issues was out of whack. We were talking a lot about how quickly we could revolutionize the production of energy. Nobody was really talking a lot about customers, about prices, about reliability. So I felt like those things need to be in the conversation, and that's what we've tried to do for the past 8 years.
And so are you dealing with the energy companies? Or are you dealing with the politicians in Washington? Or where do you kind of fit into that puzzle? We
kind of work with everybody. You know, if you really want to understand what's happening out there in the world of electricity generation, you have to work with utilities and understand what their future looks like. But you know, on the policy level, we work with a number of different states and their legislatures, with public service commissions and public utility commissions around the country, and also with policymakers in D.C., because that's where so much of policy is coming out of these days. You've really seen a shift away from, in some cases, states being able to decide their future and more toward D.C. kind of dictating what the future looks like.
What caught my attention and maybe reach out to you was this article that you had linked to, or I can't remember if you wrote it or not, about the EPA and they're trying to, you know, kind of wrap up their Obama administration agenda, and then they're getting ready to shift towards a more, I guess, pro-Trump would be the right term. Can you kind of walk through this process of how these government agencies work and how much, politics is actually involved in what's being legislated from them?
Well, most people, when they kind of go about their ordinary everyday lives, they don't really pay a lot of attention to something like the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, just by virtue of its name, you think they're out there probably measuring air quality and making sure the water is safe to drink. And that's part of what they do. But we've seen over the last, 8 years of this administration, a huge ramp up in terms of trying to kind of control what the energy sector looks like. I mean, you obviously back in the 70s had the Clean Air Act, and it's really cleaned up the air and water in the U.S. But what's happened is sometimes regulatory agencies run out of things to do. And what we've seen EPA try to do is really assert a federal control over the energy sector. So, several years ago, you had a relatively mundane sounding regulation like Utility Act, which came out, which to most people never even heard of it. But to utilities, it was a huge deal because it started to affect their ability to use coal for electricity. It started to affect their future planning. And that's when people like us really started to get concerned that we could really have a future where there was not as much reliability as there is today. One of the things people don't really think about the electric grid because it works so perfectly. But that's just here in the U.S. And you go to other countries, and that's something that people have to deal with every day. Well, it's time Americans, we think, start considering what the future looks like and whether the lights will come on when you flip the switch.
Okay, and so I want to just transition a little bit, stay within the EPA and the government agencies, though, and let's talk about something else that's been big over the last 8 years, especially under the Obama administration, is horizontal drilling and fracking. What is the EPA's current stance on that, and what is your personal stance on some of these health concerns that have been brought up by some of the left environmental groups?
Well, there's the old story you might have heard that had to do with, 1930s in Europe, and just to make it short, the catchphrase is, and then they came for this person, then they came for that person. Well, that's what EPA has done with energy sources. The low-hanging fruit for EPA was coal. And so they came out with this suite of regulations that started to degrade the ability of utilities to use coal. Regulations that dealt with mercury, regulations that dealt with ground level ozone, all these things that really made it difficult to burn coal for electricity. And at the same time, we had this natural gas boom going on in the U.S. that really came from fracking technology. And I think everybody kind of thought that EPA might leave fracking alone, but that, is probably naive on a lot of people's parts, because EPA, I think, has a lot of concerns about fracking and a lot of concerns about the future use of fossil fuels. So what you've seen is the EPA has tried really to take a few bites at the apple, which is fracking. They've done some studies to try to link fracking to groundwater contamination. There's never been a study by EPA that showed a substantial link between fracking and groundwater. But at the same time, they're trying to regulate what they call fugitive emissions from wellheads. They're trying everything they can think of to limit fracking and to give EPA some stranglehold on the future of fracking. So I think if you've been paying attention for the last 8 years, you realize that EPA is not just going to stop at coal. They're probably going to get into the business of regulating fracking. Our position on fracking is that we need natural gas in this country. The idea of being energy independent has a lot to do with our ability to frack, to generate gas from places like the Dakotas. And if we're going to have the kind of energy future we need in this country, we're going to need to keep that natural gas pipeline and that natural gas boom going.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate here for a second and say, well, okay, maybe there's no studies yet, but this fracking stuff is still pretty new. Shouldn't the government go ahead and just protect the citizens in case there is something to it in the future we find out?
Well, I think, we would be irresponsible if we ever, weren't concerned about potential linkages between a new technology and public health. The problem is, we've been doing fracking in this country, not just for a few years, but for a few decades. So if I know you're familiar with the technology, but for those out there that aren't, you're talking about drilling into really deep into the ground, way below the water table. There's really no practical way that fracking could really influence groundwater. And so that's what, in two different cases, one was in Pennsylvania, the other, I believe, was in Montana. EPA did a very detailed study on fracking and groundwater and really came away empty. There doesn't appear to be any linkage between groundwater contamination and fracking.
And, just to couple what you said, one of the frustrating things I have is that you'll see someone post a video where they'll turn on a water faucet and they'll hit a lighter, and then all of a sudden, the flame catches and see, this is because of fracking. And it's like, well, why? Why does that mean? Why does that mean that's because of fracking? Just because you showed a video of someone turning a faucet on and lighting a methane flame. And so it's good to hear that from your perspective that you're saying, hey, there's really nothing here, because a lot of stuff that's put out there isn't really scientific, at least, that goes viral, if you will. It's just propaganda.
Well, if you keep up with, fracking, you're going to see people link fracking to things like earthquakes, other seismic activity. The governor of Colorado has a background in seismology and has come out and said, there's this is just hogwash. I mean, fracking is not causing earthquakes, but you see those stories, and it is discouraging because somebody out there is believing that, and in this era of kind of fake news, anything can catch the public's attention, and unfortunately, sometimes that negatively impacts the energy sector.
Okay, and so I saw on your website, which we'll link to in the show notes for the audience, that you are talking about nuclear energy now. You had a blog post this recently. What is going on with nuclear in the United States?
The news is not great. There's some glimmers of hope if you believe in the future of nuclear and believe that nuclear should be part of the future. The U.S. invented the commercial nuclear power industry. We invented it back in the 70s. When I started this job 8 years ago, there were, I believe, 114 nuclear reactors working in the U.S. Today, that number's in the 90s. We have gone backwards. We've seen nuclear reactors shut down across the country for different reasons, not safety reasons, but just they're older plants. Some of them shut down because they weren't needed anymore. But we are falling behind the rest of the country, the rest of the world in nuclear technology. While countries like China and Turkey and even South Africa, look to build nuclear, we're shutting them down. So we feel like, today nuclear is about 1/5 of all the power in the country. That's a significant portion. It's not just a percentage, it's the fact that this stuff runs all of the time. In the energy industry, they talk about, 24/7, 365, which they call 8760 energy. Nuclear is one of those. You basically don't have to turn it off all year round. And that becomes an important backbone of the energy grid. So we feel strongly about nuclear. We believe it's safe. We believe it's inexpensive. And we feel like the more the public knows and learns about nuclear power, the more they're going to be comfortable with it.
Okay, so let me put my devil's advocate hat back on again here. Just a few years ago, we had a reactor meltdown, or maybe it was two, in Japan. That's a concern. People are saying, oh my gosh, this thing could melt down on us, and then this land is ruined for an infinite amount of time. Is that a reality? Is it a myth? Where does these meltdowns, how often do they happen, and what is the actual environmental long-term impact?
Well, there's a lot of confusion about nuclear and about nuclear accidents. I think most people's conception of a nuclear accident is kind of stuck in time with Chernobyl. That literally could not happen today. For a few reasons. Number one, we've never had a single death in the U.S. from nuclear power. Okay, even the worst accident that there's ever been in the U.S., which is 3 Mile Island, what happened was that the machinery, melted down, broke down, and the plant had to be scrapped. These plants have redundant safety features. They are regulated every day of the year. Sometimes you'll see a nuclear plant that has a safety violation or a red flag. A lot of times that's just because one part of one of their redundant systems was flagged. People who work in nuclear plants will tell you they're one of the safest places to be in America. We have really absolutely no concerns about our domestic nuclear power industry. Now, what happened in Japan, it's a little different. I mean, really what happened there was that their systems that would have cooled down the plant were built under the floodplain. We don't do that in the U.S. These things are cited very carefully. And especially in the post-Fukushima world, you'll never see another nuclear plant that's built in any kind of hazard for any kind of flooding like that. So I think if people took the time to understand what really happens in a nuclear accident, which we haven't had one since the 70s in the U.S., they would really be a lot more comfortable with it. Especially people who live around nuclear plants today are very comfortable with it just because they have been educated and understand what happens.
On the Fukushima, I listened to a BBC report about maybe a year ago now, and they were inside of the Ward-Dolph zone, and what they were saying is they were detecting the amount of radiation there, and it really wasn't dangerous. It was what you get from the sun. Is that something that's true? Is it already just dissipated that much, or was maybe they're not really given the proper perspective on the story?
Well, unless something has changed about the Fukushima accident, there has still never not been any deaths from that accident. I mean, what you had was a plant that got super hot and melted in parts. So, the radiation risk, those kind of things, there was some radiation, but what's happened is just because, as you point out, it doesn't stay around very long. And you're not talking about, lots of radiation anyway. I mean, people who work in nuclear plants, wear devices that measure radiation. Well, you're more at risk of receiving radiation from your granite countertops or naturally than you would if you worked in a nuclear power plant. There's just not a lot of fugitive radiation running around out there. It's very contained. The way these plants are built, there's just almost no way that radiation could really affect the public.
We'll be back with Lance Brown in just a second, but first, let's hear from our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
And now back to our interview with Lance Brown. Okay, one final question about nuclear, then I want to move to renewables. Well, walk us through the process of storing the rods, because that seems to be a big cause for concern, is that they're going to contaminate the earth and the bedrock and all this stuff. And I've heard some people speculate and say that really when they inject the rods into the Earth's core, that the Earth is actually more radioactive at that point than the rods are. Is that true or false, or can you shed some light on that for us?
Well, this is also a pretty misunderstood part of nuclear power. There's a couple of different ways of doing nuclear, but one of the most popular, really the one that's most prevalent in the U.S., you have these little, basically black pellets that have their uranium in them. Okay, and those become, they put them in rods that are part of the nuclear reactor unit. Those run for 18 months, and then they are replaced. Now, 97% of the energy is still in those rods. We could use them more if we wanted. We just don't do that in the U.S. But at that point, after they've been used, they are typically stored on campus at a nuclear facility in a concrete cask. And this thing has a wall of like 3 feet thick. There's no way in there, no way out. And those literally sit there and have sat there for decades in some cases. So if you were to go, for example, we have a nuclear facility here in Southeast Alabama called Plant Farley. Those nuclear casks that are storing the spent nuclear fuel are literally sitting on a concrete pad, and all the nuclear material since the 1970s, late 1970s, is sitting there doing nothing. There's people talk about this need to store nuclear fuel in, Yucca Mountain or to somehow solve this problem. There's really not a problem. It's being stored on campus very safely, and there's never been a single incident with spent nuclear fuel in the U.S.
Okay, so let's transition into renewables. Typically, environmental groups are pro-renewables, and I'm not against renewables. I'm pro-free market, so if it can work, let's get it out there and let's use it. What is the state of renewables? Because even though renewables are promoted as a safe alternative, they're not always safe. They kill birds, and there's all these other side effects. Anything man does is going to have some kind of impact on the environment. So what is the state of the renewable industry right now?
Well, I think renewables are growing. We consider ourselves energy agnostic. So I say I don't really care where the electrons come from. We just want them to be affordable and reliable. So the two main sources of renewable power today are wind power and solar. Wind power is pretty easy to understand. I mean, you can see wind turbines. When you get west of the Mississippi, you start seeing them in places like Oklahoma and Colorado and Montana, Wyoming. Those projects are very productive. They blow in a relatively understandable, predictable way. And right now, you can see purchase power agreements for wind power that, almost rival nuclear or coal-fired plants. So this is very inexpensive energy that's being delivered to customers, and there's really not a lot of problem with that. We have the most problem with solar policy, because today there are really a couple of ways to produce solar energy. One is kind of what most people might be more familiar with, which is residential rooftop solar. That's some citizen deciding they want to put a solar rooftop on their house. We have no problem with that at all. The problem comes when you start to try to compensate customers for their electrical generation. So we are, engaged in a number of states where that policy question is up for debate. And, right now there are some situations that are not that fair to customers. You're having non-solar customers having to pay more because of solar customers, and that we think that's fundamentally unfair. So we've engaged in those states, in those situations. But, there's another kind of plant, which is a more utility scale, larger plant These are more out west. They're called concentrating solar. You might see them if you fly into San Francisco or even Las Vegas. These are industrial sized plants. They're more manageable. They're more efficient, and that's what we think is the future of solar is solar projects that are larger in scale and do a better job of working with the grid instead of being dispersed from individual customers.
Okay, well, I want to leave you with one more question, and then we'll get you out of here. So let's talk about just kind of the modern state of science and kind of walk the audience through. You turn on the news and you hear a report about global warming, or you hear a report about fracking, or you hear a report about this, and they quote these big numbers, and they quote X amount of percentages of scientists across the world, and they bring out all these statistics, and you leave going, oh, wow, this is a proven fact. But that's not really the reality necessarily. Can you walk the audience through a lot of these statistics that we hear on the news and where they come from and the grants and how that stuff works so we can better understand environmental scientific news as it's given to us?
Well, a lot of presentations that I give about energy starts out with kind of this premise, which is if you want to generate electrons to put on the wires that go to people's homes, most power plants that we think of are basically steam plants. Now, the question is, how are you going to make steam? You have to create heat. And so, today, 90+% of all the power that's generated in this country comes from either coal-fired power, natural gas, or nuclear power. Now, without any of those resources, we have no way to keep the lights on. Unfortunately, there are groups in this country like the Sierra Club, like others, who are against all three of those sources. Now, to me, that is baffling because I don't know how they expect us to run an electrical grid. But if you're against coal-fired power because of some moral reason, if you're against natural gas because it's a fossil fuel, and if you're against nuclear power because you don't believe in nuclear, you have left this country with wind power and solar power to not only supply residential demand in homes around the country on cold days like today, you've also given the manufacturing sector a huge competitive disadvantage. There are steel companies, heavy manufacturers who literally cannot survive without a steady, reliable, affordable source of power. So that's the practical, way to look at how we exist and live this American life that we live. Now, when you start transitioning into questions about climate, one thing you've got to understand is somehow the media has convinced Americans that we are the leading problem when it comes to climate change. So we've somehow dragged our feet, not joined the rest of the world that's taken up this mantle. That is not true. The U.S., if you look at our share of carbon dioxide, we have been far surpassed by the Chinese. The Indians are going to surpass us. We have been steadily decreasing our emission of carbon dioxide for a couple of decades. So we're going in the right direction. Can we do more? Absolutely. But people are working on that. We're working on carbon capture. We're working on lower carbon technologies. But I think one of the things we've got to get to is, are we really going to try to solve a global problem unilaterally? We had a chance to testify to the EPA about the Clean Power Plan, and this is EPA's attempt to regulate carbon dioxide. And one of the things we left them with, just in terms of a message, was this. You're asking Americans to pay more for electricity, and yet all of the studies about the Clean Power Plan could not show any measurable impact on global climate. So we've got to get past that. We've got to get to a point where if we're asking Americans to pay more for power or to make sacrifices, that we have a very clear understanding of what impact this is going to have on the globe and on temperatures. I think that's not only fair, but it's also reasonable.
That's all great points there, and I appreciate it. And I hope one day maybe to get on someone who can explain just modeling and how that works, and how when you talk about some of these big studies that are being conducted, just a slight variation that's off in the model creates a tremendous different result. And so a lot of this stuff, when you talk about global studies, is just fractions can be off, and we have a much different outcome, which is why a lot of the climate scientists over the last 30, 40 years have just been wrong time and time and time again, because the models are tough to build out and predict. Okay, I want to get you out of here. I want to let you plug and promote whatever it is. So go ahead. I know you got a video that you've linked on your website, and you have your website. And where else can people find you? And what would you like the audience to link to you at?
Well, Ryan, if people want to keep up with what we're doing and help out in whatever way they see fit, the best way is to go to our website, which is energyfairness.org. We put out a communication piece every Tuesday, every Thursday. It's free of charge. You can go sign up for the newsletter there. We also are very active on Twitter, so our handle is @energyfairness, and I think you'll be pleased with the not only the amount of information out there, but kind of our perspective on where we should be going with American energy.
Absolutely, and we will link to all that in the show notes so you guys can find it, click to it, and go and connect with these guys. They're doing a lot of great work. Lance, thank you so much for coming on. It was good to talk to you and hope to have you on again in the future.
All right, my pleasure.
Lance, thanks again for coming on. We really appreciated all the insight that you gave us today, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to thank another reviewer. James Gordy is actually getting a double plug this episode, folks. So, James, thank you so much for your kind review. And also, as I mentioned, the APIYP had a great time seeing you the other day. So, hats off to you. He's been a guest. He reviewed the show on iTunes, and he hosted a great event the other night at the APIYP. And don't forget, we're going to link to the APIYP in the show notes. If you've got any questions, reach out to those guys, or if you want to hit me up, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com. Final reminder for Nape, if you're going to be there, let me know. I am still chewing on it, but I am leaning that way. However, I'm not 100% sure. And so, guys, I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. And as always, until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders podcast, powered by R Squared Global.